Alina's reputation grew, and something unexpected happened. Other survivors began finding their way to the mountain caves, drawn by rumors of resistance. First came Petra, a doctor whose hospital had been destroyed. Then Marcus, a young engineer who'd lost his entire family. Within 2 months, Alina's solitary campaign had become a network of 15 people, all seeking purpose in their grief. She became their leader almost by accident, though Dimitri insisted it was inevitable. "You have something they need," he told her. "Not just strategy, but hope. You showed them that fighting back is possible." She organized them carefully, teaching each person their role, building something larger than simple revenge. The turning point came during a winter storm when intelligence reached them that Volkov himself would be traveling through their territory with minimal security, believing the weather made ambush impossible. Alina's team prepared for 3 days, positioning themselves along the icy mountain road, creating obstacles that would force his convoy to slow and separate. At 4:42 p.m., as snow fell in blinding sheets, they struck with precision that surprised even themselves. Alina had designed the operation not to kill but to capture, understanding that Volkov alive was more valuable than dead. When the fighting ended and they had him bound in the back of his own vehicle, she finally stood face to face with a man who destroyed her world. "You're just a girl," Volkov spat, his face purple with rage and humiliation. Alina looked at him calmly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything she'd survived. "I was a girl. You made sure of that when you burned my village. My father, my brothers, 23 families who never hurt anyone. You took all of that. Now I'm something else entirely, something you created but can't control." She paused, letting him see the person she'd become, forged in fire and grief and purpose. "And you're going to help us end this war." They negotiated Volkov's surrender to Allied forces in exchange for testimony about the war crime committed by his superiors. His intelligence helped dismantle enemy operations throughout the region, and within 6 months, the occupation forces began their withdrawal. Alina's network evolved into an official resistance liaison, coordinating between local populations and liberating forces. She never forgot what was taken from her, but she transformed that loss into something that saved others from the same fate. Old Dimitri lived just long enough to see the enemy forces leave their mountains, and with his last breath, he told her he was proud. "You could have become a monster," he whispered. "Instead, you became exactly what they needed." Years later, when peace finally came and villages began to rebuild, people would tell stories of the ghost warrior who'd haunted the mountains during the darkest days of the war. But Alina rarely spoke of those times. She'd returned to the valley where her village once stood and helped build something new on ground that had known too much sorrow. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she'd walk to the ridge where she'd first watched the enemy camp, remembering the frightened, angry girl she'd been. That girl was gone, yes, burned away with her old life. But what emerged from those ashes had been stronger, wiser, and ultimately more merciful than her enemies could ever understand. They tried to destroy her, tried to break her spirit with fire and death. Instead, they'd forged something they could never defeat, a survivor who refused to let darkness win, who chose purpose over despair, and who'd proven that even the smallest light can push back against the greatest shadow. The smoke still clung to Alina's clothes 3 days later, a bitter reminder of everything she'd lost. She crouched behind a fallen tree on the ridge overlooking the enemy camp, her dark eyes tracking every movement below. The soldiers laughed around their fires, celebrating their latest conquest, unaware that death itself was watching them from the shadows. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rage she'd learned to control, to sharpen into something useful. She was only 19 years old, but the girl who tended her father's sheep in the valley was gone forever, burned away with everything else she'd loved. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It had happened at 2:37 a.m. on a moonless night when most of her village slept peacefully. Alina had been awake, restless, standing by her window when she saw the first torches moving down the mountain road like a river of fire. She'd screamed to wake her family, but the enemy moved with terrible speed and precision. Her father had pushed her toward the back door, pressing an old hunting knife into her hands. "Run to the caves," he'd whispered urgently, his weathered face fierce with love and fear. "Don't look back, Alina. Promise me you won't look back." But she had looked back, just once, and saw the flames consuming her home, her father's silhouette disappearing into the smoke as he tried to save her younger brothers. That image was burned into her mind more deeply than any scar. She'd run through the forest that night, her bare feet bleeding, her lungs burning with smoke and grief. The caves her father mentioned were an old shepherd's refuge in the high mountains, known only to locals who'd lived there for generations. When dawn broke and she finally dared to return to the valley's edge, there was nothing left but ash and silence. 23 families had lived in her village. Now there were only ruins and graves she couldn't even dig properly. The enemy forces had moved on, heading toward the next settlement, leaving destruction in their wake like a plague. Alina had collapsed among the ruins of what had been a home, and something inside her had cracked and reformed into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. But she hadn't been completely alone. Old Dimitri found her that afternoon, the former soldier who lived like a hermit in the upper valleys. He was 70 years old with a limp from an old war wound, but his mind was sharp as the mountain winds. "I know that look," he'd said quietly, kneeling beside her in the ash. "I wore it myself once, 40 years ago. The question is, what will you do with it?" She'd lifted her eyes to his, and he must have seen something there that satisfied him because he nodded slowly. "Come with me then. If you want revenge, I'll teach you how to take it properly. But understand this, girl, once you start down this path, you can't go back to who you were." For 6 weeks, Dimitri trained her in the mountains with a patience that surprised them both. He taught her to move silently through the forest, to track enemy patrols by the smallest signs, to think 3 steps ahead like a chess master. "They have numbers and weapons," he'd explained one evening as they studied maps by firelight. "You have knowledge of this land and the ability to strike where they don't expect it. That's your advantage, but only if you're smart about using it." He showed her how to sabotage supply lines without being detected, how to create diversions that would scatter enemy forces, how to use the terrain itself as a weapon. More importantly, he taught her patience, the hardest lesson of all. "Rage makes you reckless," he'd warned. "Channel it, control it, or it will get you killed." Her first operation came at 11:15 p.m. on a cold autumn night when enemy scouts had camped in the narrow pass below the caves. There were only 3 of them, separated from their main unit, confident and careless. Alina had poisoned their water supply with herbs that would make them sick but not kill them. Dimitri insisted she start small, learn the weight of each action. She'd watched from the darkness as they fell one by one, as their confident laughter turned to confusion and then fear. When their radio calls brought no response because she'd sabotaged their equipment, panic set in. They'd abandoned their post by dawn, stumbling back toward their base, and Alina felt something shift inside her. She had power now, the power to make them afraid. Word began to spread through the enemy ranks of a ghost in the mountains, a phantom who struck without warning and vanished without trace. Supply trucks found their fuel contaminated, ammunition dumps mysteriously caught fire, and scouts disappeared into the forest never to return. The enemy commander, a brutal man named Volkov who'd personally ordered her village burned, became obsessed with finding whoever was disrupting his operations. "It's just one person," his subordinates insisted, but Volkov knew better. "One person who knows this terrain can do more damage than a whole battalion if we don't stop them," he growled, doubling patrols and offering rewards for information.